Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. And my exciting and topical guest this week, some of you may be aware, how could you avoid it because of the BBC's propaganda, that this is the 70th anniversary of our NHS, sometimes known risibly as the envy of the world. They're only two BBC propagandists. And so to discuss this issue is somebody who knows the NHS from inside, and his name is Dr. Will. It's been really exciting having him here because, you know, I've been able to show him all my kind of my penile warts, my anal fissures, my no,
pleasure was mine, James.
I haven't really, but it is always the temptation with the doctor. Will, do you find this at parties?
Weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, yeah. People take me to one side all the time.
Do they?
Yes.
And have you ever done that thing? You know, you hear about doctors doing this where they suddenly spot the indicator that in somebody's eye or something that means they've got cancer or brain tumour, and they didn't know.
I can't say personally. I've seen a few sort of Parkinson tremors in people who don't know that it's coming on.
Oh God, have I got Parkinson tremor?
You haven't got Parkinson's tremor, no, but I've seen it a few times.
Have you?
I mean, part of my job is to stick cannulas in people. That is to give you access to someone's, give you IV access, intravenous access.
Yeah.
And I often find myself looking at people's veins on their arms, thinking how good their veins are. Because some people's veins are really rubbish.
I've got great veins.
Yeah, so have I. That's why I let the medical students practice on me.
Yes, well, no, you were telling me earlier before we started recording that when you were at medical school, they did not tell you how to put a cannula in, how to take a blood sample.
We were taught in a very kind of ridiculous way how to take a blood sample. I kid you not. I think it was around the time there was a big MRSA rubbish in the media.
Right.
And they showed us a new way to take blood. Okay, and I kid you not, it involved 4 changes of gloves and 3 hand washes for each attempt.
That's going to work, isn't it, in a practical setting?
In a practical situation, when you've got a 7-hour wait, you've got a patient who may be flagging, or you need to get the bloods away quickly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was for every attempt. I mean, you've probably got. I'm better than most because as doctors, you get asked to do the difficult cannulations, the difficult IV accesses and blood taking. Yeah, so I'm pretty good at it. But some of the phlebotomists, they're pretty good at it as well because that's their job. But some of the, say, nurses who've got the certificate on the wall but don't like getting their hands dirty, sometimes they might treat it like a bit of a pincushion.
Oh, you see, there again, I'm disabused of a notion I had, which is that I thought nurses, being as they must be doing this all the time, must be quite good at this kind of thing.
Some are, some aren't.
Right.
It's a mixture. Some of them haven't even got the training. Some of them you can actually nurse and not be qualified to take blood. And goes right down to the other end of some of them who were absolutely brilliant.
Is this the case?
I've worked shifts and we've had no nurses who've qualified to take blood or get IV access.
Now, this is probably a leading question, Dr. Will, but I suspect the answer is going to be yes. Is this partly a consequence of the change in culture whereby instead of being taught at sort of nurses' school how to do nursing and then being supervised by a ward sister in the old way and not considering themselves to be kind of semi-doctors but considering themselves to be nurses, now we have this culture where they all have to have degrees and they're almost too good to do any nursing in their heads?
Yeah, I have had that kind of opinion from a few nurses. You know, I didn't go to nursing school to change bedpans. I've heard that a few times.
You really have, literally?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
And what do you say?
Oh, I don't say anything. I just tell people like you.
So you're partly responsible for this culture by not.
It's all my fault. Yeah.
Right. Not blaming the. But I mean, isn't that rather frustrating to you? You're the doctor. You've got your doctor stuff to do, and then but there's the wards to be run, patients to be looked after.
Yeah.
I mean, how? Tell me.
Well, A&E, theoretically,
Yeah.
okay, that's where I work, Accident and Emergency Department. Everyone has a defined role. The nurse is there to nurse.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would prescribe the medicine or the IV fluids. The nurse would then go and get the IV fluids and the medicine out the cupboard and administrate it.
Yeah.
Okay? If the patient had been incontinent, the nurse would clean them. They would look after them. They would do the nursing.
Yeah.
I would do the ordering the x-rays, prescribing the medication, as I say, making a diagnosis, telling them to go home if there was nothing wrong with them, or referring them to a colleague if they needed admitting for something. Yeah. But I've found over the last few years it's actually become easier for me to actually start doing a lot of the nursing stuff myself, because it's just so busy, and actually asking a nurse to do something tends to get you into trouble sometimes. And I won't say that about every nurse, because that's not true. Some are absolutely brilliant. But some nurses will, if you ask them to do an ECG for you, will say, oh, I'm not free for at least 3 hours. So I end up doing it myself. I end up dipping all my own urines for urine infections myself, because it's quicker. I just found that works for me. I often wheel my own patients down to the radiology department to get their brain scans done, because it's better than waiting an hour and a half for a porter to come. That works for me. And other doctors won't do that.
Yeah.
Other doctors think they're too
big to put, too
big
crammed to push.
Yeah, well, they don't like sticking a small plastic tab in a jar of urine, for instance, which has never really bothered me. It gives me an instant answer, and I don't have to bother anyone else about it and get crap off anyone else.
Right.
But there are still doctors, many nationalities of doctors in the NHS, as you know.
Yeah.
And there are differences, cultural differences.
Right.
But in what? Well, for instance, I would say like in India is still a very hierarchical society.
Yeah.
So when Indian doctors come, they often have a very kind of high opinion of themselves and a very sort of disparaging way of treating their people who are less qualified, or to the nursing staff.
Oh my goodness.
And a few of them have to be told off quite strictly.
I bet the nurses love that, don't they? I bet.
Well,
my goodness.
They don't love it. They tend to learn, or they don't last very long.
Yeah.
But that's been my experience with a lot of Indian doctors.
Okay, but
pick them out.
I mean, the foreign doctors we're getting, are they up to scratch? Have they got the English skills, and have they got the technical skills?
Some have, some haven't.
Right.
I have worked with a doctor from Belarus who was probably certifiably mad. Everything was a conspiracy theory. He said to me, I tell you, my friend, there's this village in Georgia. They all live 180 years old. 180 years old, I tell you. And he said this as if he was telling me 2 + 2 = 4. And then he started telling me about how the Americans were seeding clouds to make the Slavs infertile. And he was telling me this. Like, he believed it. Yeah?
But how was his bedside manner, and how
crap?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, we did have a patient with scabies once. Now, scabies is an insect infection which you often get between your fingers. Yeah. And I remember once asking him, "Have you seen scabies before?" And he said, "Yes, of course. I'm from Belarus."
So he was good on scabies, but
he was good on scabies. But as a doctor, he was mad as a box of frogs. Now, the other Eastern European doctors I've worked with, Romanian, Polish, Slovakian, have all been pretty good.
Right.
And nurses as well. They've all been pretty good.
Right.
Their English has been very good. Their diagnosis skills has been very, very good. The ones that I worry about are the ones that come from the sort of Mediterranean areas. They're the ones I've had bad experiences with.
What sort of southern, sort of North Africa, or?
I've had a Spanish doctor who sent a patient home to their GP with an obstructed kidney. I've had a Turkish doctor who sent a lady home with bilateral cellulitis, which is a skin infection, which is often caused by like a mosquito bite, and then the bugs get under the skin, and you get this massive sort of red, painful, inflamed edematous leg, and it jumped from one leg to the other. And the woman's temperature was to 38. She was shivering. She was vomiting. And he sent her home with E45 cream and told her it was nothing more than a bit of eczema.
Right.
So we've had that.
So
and a few horror stories from people on holiday as well.
Are we talking about the sort of southern Mediterranean temperament here, or are we talking about just a lack of training, or what?
I just think it's a lack of training. From what I've seen of the few Spanish doctors, the Turkish doctor we had was an absolute nightmare. The Belarusian guy was mad as a box of frogs. But then on the flip side, as I say, the Romanian doctor that I work with, the few Polish doctors I've worked with have been absolutely brilliant.
Because it's a mix. Isn't that part of the problem with the NHS? You just don't know what you're going to get. It's like the box of chocolates in
A&E,
Forrest Gump.
In A&E, you might get lucky and be seen by a consultant who's been doing the job for 20 years.
Yeah.
Or you might get unlucky and
get
be seen...
you.
Oh, no. You'd probably be lucky if you see me, actually. I've got my head screwed on. I like to think so.
Yeah.
But you might see someone who's like sort of doing a rotation on their first week as part of their junior doctoring, who doesn't know their arse from their elbow.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And as I said to you earlier in the pub, when things start getting tricky and the going gets tough, you automatically expect your seniors to jump in and help you. Whereas more often than not, your seniors are the first to bugger off out the door when it gets tough.
My most recent brush with the NHS, I suppose, with the hospital system, was when I had my hunting accident and I bust my collarbone and several ribs and stuff.
Yeah.
And my experience at Gloucester A&E was an absolute nightmare. I mean, I had to wait a long time, and they really didn't. They were very offhand with me. Whereas Coventry, when I had my pulmonary embolism, all the nurses I had were really good, and there was a Zimbabwean, there was they were all mixed. And yet, if you ended up at somewhere like Mid Staffordshire hospitals, where
I'm aware of the story. Yeah,
I mean,
the worst place I've ever worked at is a place called Tameside, which is in Manchester.
Yeah,
it's actually known as Shameside by the people that who've worked there.
But yeah,
Blackpool Hospital was pretty shocking as well. I would never go back to either of those two hospitals.
So how do they? How is this allowed? The system. I mean, surely there ought to be. God knows, aren't there enough NHS administrators on our tax dollar, but supposedly ensuring that these places don't turn into kill zones?
Yeah, I think you have to let's take a step back here. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see what we're trying to do in an accident and emergency department, okay? Anybody with anything at any time in the day can walk in and ask to see a fully qualified professional for free. Where else are you going to get that service?
When you put it like that, yeah.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is bloody hard, okay? And sometimes it messes up.
Yeah.
And some places mess up worse than others.
Yes.
All right? But as I say, I have to see anything from a psychiatric patient to an obstetric and gynecology patient to a dermatological problem to a surgical problem. I have to do resus. I have to see dead children. I have to certify people dead. I have to... we could do the rest of the podcast by listing what I have to do. Okay, so I apologise if it's all my fault personally that the NHS isn't as good as it could be.
Yeah.
But we are trying to do a difficult job.
Okay, I'm with you on that one. I'm sensing from this and earlier conversations that you don't think the NHS is perfect. If you were for example, let's take A&E.
Yeah.
If you were going to reform the NHS, what would you do?
I don't think I've really put a lot of thought into. I mean, I've used my time to sort of... I would never have been any good at a desk job. I would have been good in the trenches in World War I or manning an ACAT gun in World War II. I've been very good at that.
Yeah.
So A&E is the closest thing I'm going to get to a war zone in 2018.
Yeah.
So that's why I do it. How would I improve it? Well, as I said to you earlier, the biggest problem that I see is there's this kind of twilight zone where you have patients who aren't well enough to be managed by their GP. Yeah. Or the problem, it can't be managed by a GP, one appointment every 3 weeks with a few pills and off you go, sunshine. But yet when they come to hospital, all the blood tests and all the chest x-rays and all the blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, blah, 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 is normal. So they get sent back to their GP. Now, there's a lot of people in this kind of twilight zone where, as I say, they're not unwell enough to be acutely admitted, but neither are they well enough or fit enough or it's appropriate enough for them to be managed by someone they see for 10 minutes every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So I would try and do something to try and fix that black hole.
So what you're asking for there is actually even more NHS time and money being dedicated to looking at people's problems in more detail.
Well, the other thing I would do, I've been working over 10 years now in the A&E. There is a kind of customer culture that has developed, i.e. the patient is the customer and the customer is always right. And there's now kind of insidious fear in the background that, we could be sued if we don't do this, and we could be complained about, and all complaints taken seriously. Complaints go against your record, whether they're just full of absolute nonsense or not.
Yeah. They
get counted against you. I've been fortunate. I've had 2 complaints against me in 10 years.
Oh,
both of them were absolute nonsense. One was because I wouldn't admit a lady. She'd come in with some problems with her legs, but she wasn't acutely unwell. She didn't need to be admitted to hospital.
Yeah.
But she was the story came out that she was living at home with 2 octogenarian parents who she was having to look after.
Right.
And she fancied a few days in hospital, I imagine.
Yeah.
So she wrote a letter just basically saying how bad I was and how ill she was and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
The second one was just a complete load of nonsense. It was a woman who'd come in with knee pain, who I'd done an X-ray on and given some medicine to, painkillers. It's an orthopedic problem. You need to see an orthopedic doctor. I'm sorry, go back to GP, get referred. Yeah. And she just basically wrote this letter, just basically abusing the entire NHS, its whole staff and everything. I mean, the letter said more about her than it said about me at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, these complaints count. It doesn't matter if they're all nonsensical. So to try and go back to what I was saying, I mean, I wasn't alive in 1940, 1950, 1960, but I got a sense of it was much more kind of military in those days. The patient did what they were told.
Yeah.
Matron kept everyone in line. The doctor came round. This for you, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Doctor. Yes, Mr. Doctor. Yes, Mr. Doctor. Well, that's completely flipped now. Now we're the yes, sir, no, sir people. Yeah. Otherwise, the dreaded complaint comes in. It goes against you. They refer you to the GMC, and the GMC will investigate everything. Can take them at least 6 months of all that stress and hardship. So it can be quite difficult. What I'm trying to say, I suppose, in a very bad and long way, is I'd like a bit more of a deferential culture to come back. Yeah. I'd like to be able to tell people to say, get stuffed.
Yeah. Yes,
you're not sick, mate. Okay? I'm not doing bloods. I'm not doing chest x-ray. I'm not like you occupying that cubicle for 3 hours because you're not sick. You're trying to get a bed for the night because you're homeless or because you're an alcoholic and you've fallen down the stairs and the paramedics have brought you in, but there's nothing bloody wrong with you.
No, that's interesting you raised that point.
Now, if I could, be a bit more officious with patients and not worry about the complaints culture that's developed, I think we could move people through 2 or 3 times as quickly.
That's very interesting you say that. When I used to live in London,
yeah,
I was very struck by the fact that, and it seemed to be happening increasingly, that I'd be walking around the streets and I would see an ambulance tending somebody who had collapsed in the street, and you'd sort of
lucky an ambulance turned up.
You'd be a rubbernecker, and there'd normally be police involved as well. And you just glance at what's happening, and you realised it was a drunk. It was a drunk, down and out person having this medical team and the police team dealing with this incident, as presumably they were obliged.
They're lucky they turned up, as I say.
Well,
I could tell you a few stories about people.
This was 10 years ago, mind. So it's probably got worse since then. But yeah, how much NHS time is kind of wasted on people that?
A lot. I mean, every hospital has its regulars, its frequent flyers. Yeah, they tend to be druggies or alcoholics.
Yeah.
All right. Either they'll come in because they're MDTs, because their dole check has been spent and they haven't got any money to buy booze, or they'll fall down the stairs because they're drunk, or they'll come in some sort of mental crisis that they can't go on anymore. I'm not unsympathetic.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the only person that can help the alcoholic is the alcoholic. And, coming into my A&E after falling sort of don't know. It's a difficult one. If there was an easy answer, we would have found it by now. But I would probably say that 90% of the people don't use my service. There's a 10% that use 90% of the resources.
Right, yes. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast, the special 70th anniversary Our NHS edition with Dr. Will.
NHS.
Dr. Will, more in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Censorship is a key issue here, particularly for people on the right. Do you think it was addressed adequately?
Definitely not. It was useful to name check Diamond and Silk. It was useful to check even politicians who had campaign ads that were shut down. But in every case, Zuckerberg was allowed to essentially dismiss the case and move on.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and this is the special Our NHS 70th anniversary edition with my special guest, who's there on the front line in A&E, Dr. Will. Dr. Will, I know that you are of a conservative-ish persuasion because you listen to the podcast and you kind of agree with a lot of the sentiments expressed in it. One of my fears about the NHS is that because it's essentially built on a 1948 quasi-Stalinist model by one of the most left-wing governments in British history. I mean, I don't know why they get so much credit, because given that we had a perfectly functioning health system, in the Victorian era, we had
course of leeches.
We had some really good hospitals. Don't undermine my argument with your facile interjections, Dr. Will. There's much been written on this. We had a very very effective system of local hospitals founded by generous benefactors and run well. True. Then it got the whole thing got effectively nationalised by Attlee's government, socialist government, and we now have this hangover from that period, from that era, when healthcare needs were completely different, when the population died, when people retired at 65, died at 67. Exactly. So there weren't many years to be...
Yeah, and the amount of treatments that were available 70 years ago were minuscule to the amount of treatments that we can do now.
Exactly.
So costs have gone up exponentially because we can do more.
Yeah. And yet there was some interesting statistics released in the papers only the other day, which pointed out that there are many countries which spend far less per capita on healthcare than we do, which yet have a better quality of service, higher cancer survival rates, etc., etc., etc. The area where the NHS scores very highly is on equality, because it's like socialism. Everyone is reduced to the same level of misery.
Well, of course, you can't lift people up if they're not up to it. You can only pull everyone down to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah,
that's why communism doesn't work.
Yeah. So, but you mentioned in the pause between this and the last section that one of the things that had struck you was that what exactly? How are we going to improve the?
Well, I think it goes back to this kind of worry about yourself. Okay, I always tell my junior colleagues, when they come to me with queries about patients, I say to them, maybe I'm probably part of the problem, but I say to them, who is the most important person here? You or the patient? And they go, well, the patient, of course. And I say to them, no, it's you. You have to protect yourself, okay? So even though I know this patient almost certainly doesn't need a chest x-ray, almost certainly doesn't need an ECG, almost certainly doesn't need a massive full set of blood tests that can cost 50 quid for each single test, I tell them to do it anyway, just to cover their own backsides.
Yes.
Okay? So it goes back again to this kind of culture of, well, I suppose I'm part of the problem, arse covering.
Well, but it's litigation culture, isn't it? You don't want to get sued.
Well,
understandably,
hardly anyone actually does get sued. There's a massive fear of being sued, but I've never met anyone who's been sued. I've met people who've gone in front of the GMC and have gone through the process and had a slap wrist now and again, but I've never met. Well, I have met one doctor I describe as a criminal, but maybe we could talk about her
Right.
at some point.
Well, yeah, actually, the story that's emerged of the woman doctor who was losing a large number of patients.
Well, it happened. I can't give too much away. I can't break confidentiality, and I know what happened. Basically, one of the perks of being a junior doctor, your first year out of medical school, is if a patient dies and is going to be cremated, the family have to purchase a cremation form, okay? It's 85 quid. Well, when in my day it was about 75. I think it's about 85 quid now. Yeah. So one of the perks of a junior doctor, you get to do the cremation forms and pocket the 85 quid.
Do you really?
Yes.
That's real?
That is seriously real. So it's in your interests for your patients to drop dead. When one of my first rotations was haematology. We had cancer patients, leukemia patients. I was there for 3 months. There were 16 patients on the ward. 3 months later, there were only 2 of them were alive. And I got all those 14 cremation forms. So I made over £1,000. You're supposed to declare it to the taxman, but no one ever does. So there is a kind of almost absurd vested interest in seeing patients die as an F1.
Right.
I mean,
We're not suggesting that happened in any kind of specific cases going on now.
The specific case that happened one weekend when I was on call. Okay.
This is in a different hospital to the one in the news at the moment. We're not talking. Okay.
Now, what happened this weekend? Okay, was there can be a little bit of competition between the junior doctors, particularly if there's 2 or 3 of them on a large ward, over who gets the cremation forms, because it's money.
This is so sick.
I know, but it's true.
Yeah.
Now, what happened this weekend? I was on call with the medical team. Okay. Yeah. I was the junior. I had a senior house officer above me, who was the crook. I had a registrar who didn't get out of bed all weekend, and we had a consultant who was on the end of the telephone and didn't like to be disturbed. Yeah. So basically, me and this crook were running the hospital ourselves, me after being out of medical school for about 8 months.
Right.
I think we had about 9 deaths that weekend. Okay. Now, the cremation office, where you go to do the cremation form, is not open on a Saturday and Sunday. So what the crafty cow did was all the patients who died that weekend, she took all their notes and obviously stuck them in the boot of a Vauxhall Astra. And then suddenly, patients are dead, their notes are missing, the whole hospital is going into lockdown, directors are being called in and, we've lost 9 sets of dead patient notes, where have they gone? Monday morning, she turns up at the cremation office with all 9 sets of notes, proceeds to do 9 cremation forms, pockets £700, and carries on as if nothing's happened. So I go to the cremation lady and take her to one side and explain. And she said, I think you better keep that to yourself. They're just glad to have the notes back.
Oh, yes. Do you think that this would happen in the private sector? Is this not the kind of thing that arises?
Well, I don't know about whether the law stands about cremation forms. It's about pacemakers, because apparently pacemakers explode if you cremate a body with them, and they can be quite dangerous. So the certification is basically that the patient hasn't got a pacemaker. Right. So there's obviously going to be some sort of legal requirement if you're going to cremate a body to have that form done.
But where ultimately is this money? This is taxpayers' money.
Well, it's taxpayers' money, and it's going into junior doctors' pockets.
But 80 quid?
85. It's about, well, I think it was 75 in my day. I think it's pushing 90 quid now.
We're talking a large number of people who must die in hospital.
If you're on
requiring these
if you're on a respiratory ward where they drop dead in 5 minutes, you could probably lose 10 patients in a weekend. You could probably lose 15 patients in a week. Some serious cash can be made on the side.
Is it a bit like the Goa police all want to be posted to the coast where the tourists are, where they can bust them for drugs? Is it a cash cow? Everyone wants to be on the respiratory ward because
in fact, it's actually the opposite.
Is it?
Actually, no one wants to be on the respiratory ward because they all get so sick so bloody quickly. Okay, because if you can't breathe, you've got about 2 minutes. Whereas
that's why my pulmonary embolism was so dangerous, I suppose, because it's why it's such a big killer.
Yeah. So the respiratory ward is the job you want to avoid. The job you probably want to get as a junior doctor would be some sort of nice, quiet dermatology ward, or maybe an orthopedic ward if the orthopedic... No, I take that back, actually. Orthopedic wards are a death zone because the orthopedic doctors aren't any good at anything other than hips.
Right.
But yet, the 98-year-olds don't just come in with broken hips, do they?
No.
But they're not interested in when they get sick or they get septic or anything like that. So the orthopedic wards used to be terrible for patients dropping dead because the orthopedic surgeons, i.e. the consultants, were only interested in the hips and the knees and the ankles. And the poor old junior doctors were getting left to manage these 100-year-olds in heart failure, kidney failure, brain failure, whatever you like. So yeah, a cushy little dermatology job, perhaps. Maybe a general surgery job. That was quite an easy one. We had quite a nice surgeon. For a surgeon, he was quite nice anyway. Yeah, there's still a bit of a Victorian culture around surgery, particularly orthopaedic surgery. There's a lot of bullying of juniors still goes on, lots of abuse and stuff like that.
Is that
it's better than it was.
People who call themselves Mr. rather than Doctor, they tend to be quite high and mighty.
They can be a bit up their own backsides. Well, not as a general rule, but there's a higher proportion of people up their own backsides in the orthopedic profession than, say, in the medical or the dermatological or the obstetric branches of medicine.
Right. Tell me, I know that the NHS is short of beds. And my experience when I had my pulmonary embolism, I think I was in a ward of had about 6 beds in it. And I would say, I was the only patient in that ward who had a genuine acute problem that merited a place in the acute ward. Everyone else was an old person who had
bed blocking.
Bed blocking. Some of them had dementia. I remember working in the night as one sort of shat himself, and a whole bevy of nurses had to come in and clean up. He was sort of ranting and raving. They were nice old boys, and I felt sorry for them. But they'd been probably admitted for an acute issue originally, and then they'd stayed because maybe they hadn't been able to go to the loo, and so suddenly you've got problems that do merit them being kept in to be looked after.
Well, often they're not safe enough to go home, you see. Because often they live alone because the spouse has died. The kids have buggered off 200 miles to university and not come back and aren't interested. So often they may not be acutely unwell to be in hospital, but they're not safe to go home because they can't stand up. They can't get up the stairs to go to the toilet. So you can't discharge them because it's unsafe to discharge them. So...
How do we sort out that problem then?
Well, we're living too longer, aren't we? I mean, people would have dropped dead at 67, as you rightly pointed out, in 1945. And we wouldn't have 85-year-olds blocking beds.
No.
But that's what medicine has done. We've all got to die at some point.
Do you not get the feeling? I mean, talking to you, I can tell that the NHS, it's a but barely functioning system. And it clearly needs reform. But all one ever hears from government ministers is, oh, God bless our NHS, isn't it wonderful?
You're not going to say anything else, are
No,
they?
but isn't that the problem? That no one is addressing the serious problems with the system. We're all just telling ourselves this beautiful lie.
Well, I've been in the same hospital now for 3 years. And every single shift in those 3 years, we have had no beds. Okay?
That's the sound of my jaw hitting the floor.
I've seen people who've been left in A&E for 3 days. I've gone home on a Friday after referring to the medical team, who were supposed to then take them to the medical ward. Okay? I've referred them on the Friday night. I've come back on the Monday morning, and they're still in the same cubicle in A&E. And this is the hospital that I'm currently working at.
Oh my goodness!
I won't tell you the name of it.
No.
But it's one of the worst performing hospitals in the UK. But we have never, ever had beds available when I've started my shift. It's always been one out, one in.
And just remind me, is Britain a third world country or a first world?
Well, theoretically, apparently, hospitals are only supposed to run 80% capacity.
Right.
You're supposed to leave 20% of your beds open and free in case of war, famine and pestilence. Yeah?
Yes,
but
well, quite. I mean, imagine if a terrorist incident happened where your hospital is. Where would the availability be for, what would they do?
I imagine what they did in Paris in 1914 when they were told to prepare for 40,000 casualties.
What happened?
I don't think it was a very good outcome for a lot of people.
Churches or...
I heard that Battle of the Frontiers, end of Battle of Frontiers 1914, prepare for 40,000 wounded to the Paris doctors. They were like, what?
Yeah, well, yes, well, I can see that. You were telling me another horror story about the health and safety procedures which actually make things worse. That poor old woman. Tell me about that.
This happened a few years back, but the policy is still happening, and it still happens. This was happened at a nursing home. A lady had a fall, and she'd fallen head first, and she was lying face down on a hard concrete floor. Her forehead was touching the floor. Now, none of the care staff there were allowed to move her.
Why not?
Their procedure says wait until the paramedics turn up before you move them. Presumably in case they've got like a neck injury.
But where would this procedure come from? Presumably there's some sort of...
There's obviously a policy that the home has that none of you are trained, trauma trained. So
but they wouldn't
you have to wait for the ambulance to turn up. And none of you are allowed to touch her just in case she has a spinal injury.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, they phone the ambulance, and then the conversation goes something like, well, is she acutely unwell? Is she unstable? No. Have you done a pulse? Is okay? Is she breathing okay? Is she fully conscious? Yes. Okay, well, we'll send an ambulance when we can. And the ambulance turned up 13 hours later, and she'd been left lying face down on the floor for 13 hours. When she came into the hospital, her whole face was full of massive blisters, pressure sores, from where she'd just been left on the floor. They hadn't given her any water, anything to drink. Her blood pressure was in her boots. All because of the health and safety culture and the fact that it took 13 hours for an ambulance to turn up.
Now, Dr. Wood, you actually broached one of my wife's favourite topics, which is there seems to be an absence of common sense in our system now. I mean, surely anyone in the medical... even not a doctor or a nurse, would see an 80-year-old woman lying face down on the floor for 13 hours and think, well...
Yeah, but these were nursing home staff. These were possibly Filipino, Eastern Europeans getting paid minimum wage to...
And they've got their orders, I suppose, to follow.
Yeah, and they're looking after number one as well. If they move them and there was a spinal problem, they could have got themselves into trouble. You're right, though. Common sense has to come into it at some point. You're going to do more damage by leaving someone face down on a floor for 13 hours than you are by risking... you can stabilise their head and turn them over. I mean, you could do that, James.
Yeah.
You know. So, yeah, I mean, but you know what they say about common sense?
What do they say?
It's not that common.
Let me chip in another example of the kind of regulatory stupidity that makes things worse, not better. A few years ago, the Welsh NHS, which has got to be, I mean, it makes even yours look pretty bad. Look better by comparison, rather. Is that because I've had some really shit experiences in Welsh A&E.
I can't say I've ever been to
I fell into
a Welsh hospital.
I fell into a ha-ha at a wedding. Yeah, you don't.
What's a ha-ha?
A ha-ha. A ha-ha is if you have a grand country house. And you have a lawn, and then at the end of the lawn you have a drop of maybe 6-10 feet, and you have it's like a moat.
Okay.
And then it
keeps the barbarians out.
No, it keeps the cattle out. It keeps so you have your ornamental cattle grazing in the fields below. But the eye is tricked into imagining that your lawn is contiguous with the pastures beyond. Anyway, I'm a
city boy, I'm afraid.
I fell.
I've learned something there.
6-10 feet in the dark into the ha-ha in Wales, and ended up in Abergavenny Hospital.
Were you under the influence of anything at the time?
No, I tell you the problem. They had these fancy lights shining at the house and illuminating. So I was walking towards, and I couldn't see a thing.
Yeah.
So like the first thing I knew was when I was falling through space and I hit the ground. And
You're a disaster, aren't you, medically?
They wouldn't even give me any painkillers. It was just so shit. But anyway, Welsh NHS, one of the regulations they introduced, and you can just imagine the Welsh, whatever they call their silly Mickey Mouse Parliament,
the Welsh Assembly, yeah.
You can imagine all the AMs saying, "Oh, look, you boyo, this is a fantastic improvement on health." From now on, we're going to make a rule whereby anyone who administers any form of medication must be a qualified nurse. Well, can you imagine how that works in a care home where, you know, Mrs. Jones has to have her daily...
like she's on 20 pills a day.
Yeah, and you have to wait for a nurse to administer. I mean, that's the kind of bureaucracy which I think is making a bad system worse.
But what do you do? I mean, if you give the wrong drugs in the wrong dose to the wrong person, you can
stop undermining my case here. Look, it's bloody... Yeah, if you're giving somebody stuff like
we're on the same side.
We're on the same side.
2 + 2 will always equal 4 to me, James.
Well, I think 2 + 2 equals I'm right and you're wrong, mate. Look, here we are.
Paying for this abuse?
Here we are. You and I are trying to work out solutions to a broken system. Ooh,
I thought I was supposed to here to tell you my horror stories.
I need a pee. A catheter's not going to work. I'm actually going to do it manually. So more in a moment. You're listening to the
we don't do female catheters anymore because of the risk of litigation. Male doctors are not allowed to do female catheterization anymore.
You totally don't surprise me, but that is rather worrying. Okay, you're listening to Delingpole Podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my special guest on this 70th anniversary NHS edition, Dr. Will. More in a moment.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I want to actually take a couple of the references to Donald Trump from hip-hop. And then we're going to try to see if we can figure out why they like Donald Trump. Jay-Z said, I'm at the Trump International. Ask for me. Raekwon said, I'm the black Trump. They are comparing themselves to what he represents. His wealth, his achievement. Capitalism.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
This is the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and it's the NHS 70th anniversary special edition with my insider, Dr. Will. Dr. Will, you were just telling me something rather took me aback. I think I'm in the wrong bloody profession. You were saying how much locums can earn in the NHS. Well, what is a locum, first of all?
Okay, you have two choices as a doctor, okay? Everyone has to do the first 2 years of junior doctoring. It's called F1 and F2, Foundation Year 1, Foundation Year 2. After that, you get signed off as a competent doctor. So you've done 5 years of medical school, you've done your 2 years of F1, F2, you get signed off as competent doctor, and away you go. Okay, you are now what's known as a senior house officer, which is one above a junior doctor. Okay, now because no one wants to work in A&E because it's so crap and stressful and all the other stuff that goes on, they struggle to get people to work in A&E.
Right.
So the free market kicks in, and all these locum agencies start ringing you up randomly and start offering you £80 an hour. You know, you run yourself as a limited company, so all that £80 an hour goes in your pocket, and of which you maybe pay a small proportion back at the end of the year to the government after you've been as creative with your expenses as you possibly can, and you can make rather a lot of money. Well, if you're a consultant, you could probably make £100 an hour.
Right.
Now, if you're on call for a weekend as a locum for 72 hours, if you're on call, you probably might make 50 because you're not actually there. You're on the end of a telephone.
Yeah.
But if you were actually there, if you did a 70-hour week, they might pay you £100 an hour. Okay? So you're going to take £7,000 a week home for a week's work in A&E. And that's going in your pocket because you're a limited company. You're being paid as a limited company. Okay?
So if you were a junior doctor working those same hours,
even as a senior house officer, so you've done your F1 and F2, you've been signed off. Okay, this is what I did. My wife was having a baby after I finished my F2, and I decided my last rotation was accident and emergency, and I said to them, look, can I stay on as a locum for a year? And they said, fine, we're short of locum doctors. We know you can do the job. We'll pay you £50 an hour. Anyway, the junior doctors still work quite long hours. It's not like the old days when they didn't go to bed for 100 hours at a time. But I was doing 70-hour weeks. 70-hour weeks times £50 an hour going in your pocket. I was taking home £3,500 a week after being qualified for 2 years.
Oh, how do I get to be a doctor again? Can I transfer?
Well, they've buggered it up now, you see. When I went to medical school, how can I say this without the GMC striking me off very quickly? When I went to medical school, I was slightly older than 18.
Yeah.
Okay? I'd done a degree before. Mm-hmm. In those days, you could still get student loans for a second degree, and the tuition fees were £1,000 a year. Mm-hmm. Okay? Nowadays, if you want to do a second degree, you can't get student loans, and the tuition fees are about 10 grand a year. So if you want to go to medical school, James, you probably are a little bit too old, I'm afraid. But I think that they're remunerated was about 45.
And also, don't I need a...
But you'd have to fund it up front.
Yeah, and I
you'd
think
have
I might
to find
need
50 grand.
I might need biology, chemistry, physics, maths.
Actually, a degree. I mean, I've heard of someone who got on with a degree in music.
Oh, well, English literature.
I mean,
I've read books about...
She had to go back and do an A-level biology.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, yeah, she basically got in on the back of a degree in music, a 2-1 degree in music.
Do you know what? I think actually it wouldn't be a bad idea that if you had people like me being doctors. Because, okay...
Well, if you've got 50 grand up front and you can support yourself while you're there with another 50 grand, probably more that you'll need for 5 years, you can go.
Okay.
I mean, the vets that I met later on who were funding themselves, they reckon it was costing them 100 grand to train as a vet.
Yeah, but look at the upside.
Well, the beauty of what the vet can do is they can work for themselves. They can be a boss.
Just tell me, though.
I have to have a boss.
Going back, so we, the taxpayer, are paying people £100 an hour, possibly, to be locums. There surely has to be a more cost-effective way of doing it. I mean, isn't locum a kind of premium rate?
The free market has kicked in. No one wants to work in A&E. So the cost of getting a doctor to work in A&E at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning will go up to what the market rate is. And the market rate for a consultant to go and work in a dodgy hospital at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning is about £100 an hour.
But I'd be interested to see how that works in other countries, how it works in Singapore, for example.
I mean, I think the government have recently announced they're going to make it easier for doctors from places like India to come here.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. I think they'll all be channelled into places like A&E.
Yeah.
But their quality will vary.
Right.
It
is actually an argument for having more Eastern Europeans, isn't it? For Romanians. Because, I mean, the wage differential.
But the trouble is they sniff it out as well. They suddenly... You see, what was happening was when I was an SHO doing that first locum year, I was making twice as much money as the consultants who'd been there for 20 years. And it was causing really bad feelings.
Well, I can see that. Yeah, that's wrong.
But other doctors were starting to sniff it out, and they were all dropping out and then coming back into the same job on 3 times the money.
Of course they were. So, tell me, is the NHS top heavy with management?
I'm underqualified to answer that. I don't know much about the management. That kind of
because you're just
thing.
So busy kind of firefighting, you haven't really got time.
Yeah, that is it.
Yeah.
Basically, one thing you said the right word. Actually, that's how I describe my job. I'm basically running around fighting fires.
Yeah.
And one thing I do miss is I miss that ability to be creative. I admire. I'm jealous of people who can build something or create something
or do an incredibly good
podcast like yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're creating something, aren't you, James? There's something for the historical record there. All I'm doing is running around putting very small plasters on very large wounds.
You're saving lives. Yeah, but
am I saving lives?
I don't know. Have you ever actually?
They all die in the end, James. I'm just prolonging their agony.
Have you ever?
That's what they do on the respiratory ward. They just prolong their agony. These people would have dropped dead 10 years ago. We're just keeping them alive in absolute agony and sticking pins in them every 10 minutes.
All right, but cynicism aside, Dr. Will, have you...
Cynicism is the truth.
Allowing your moment of glory, have you ever saved anyone's...
Have I ever saved anyone's life?
And been conscious of having done so?
I probably save... maybe 20 to 30 people's lives a week.
Do you really?
Well, compared to if this was the 15th century.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Because let's say you come in and you're septic, you're infected and you're shivering and your blood pressure's falling, you're going unconscious. You're not long for this world.
So what do you do?
Well, in the 15th century, someone would probably have put a load of leeches over you and bled you and given you the last rites.
Right.
I can go into the drug cupboard, pull out something called tazocin, which is basically bleach for microbes.
Yeah.
I can stick a bag of fluid up. I can pump a load of blood into you if you've lost a lot of blood, and very quickly you'll get better.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So technically I've saved your life.
Yeah.
But I never really think about it that way. I don't sort of go into the toilets afterwards and high five myself and it's just like, you're septic.
Yeah.
Okay, you need Taz fluids, IV paracetamol, we need a set of bloods, we need chest X-ray, we need ECG, we need bang, bang, bang. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
And then on to the next one, and on to the next one, and on to the next one.
Yeah.
But as I say, if this was the 13th century, then I'd be pretty hopeless.
Do you watch, by the way, any medical TV dramas?
No, I cannot watch it. I don't know, I'll give you a good example, but I spend my life in an A&E hospital. I spend, apart from the time with my family, obviously, and the last thing I want to do is watch it again on television. And the ones I've watched are always so bloody dramatic.
Yeah.
And it's like, and here comes the doctor to give them the IV fluids, which will save their lives. And to me, that's just like scratching my bum, but it's like, it's kind of put together as if like this is just sort of, sort of building a fusion bomb or something like that,
Yeah.
Put a man on the moon.
Can I say, Dr. Will, it's been absolutely thrilling having you on the podcast, and you've been brilliant on the... If I was scoring your performance, I would give you... Out of 10, I would give you 11 for your stories about being a frontline A&E doctor, and I would give you about...
I've only told you a tenth of it.
Well, you can tell me a few more. Tell me another one before we go. But I would give you about a 2 for your analysis of how we fix this mess.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think you scored me rather highly, actually.
All right,
it's not in my interest to fix the NHS. I'm on the gravy train,
Yes.
James. It's my interest for it to fail, for less doctors to want to work in A&E, because my hourly rate goes up.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got to be honest.
Do you know, it's funny.
Sniff it out anyway.
It's funny you say that. I've got a friend who is a criminal QC, and he says exactly the same thing. He says, look, I want more Islamic terrorists and sort of criminal immigrants coming in, causing all manner of trouble. I want things to get worse because it's more work for me. Yeah.
Well, how about we do Eastern Europeans then again?
What?
Eastern European patients rather than Eastern European staff.
What? Are they a peculiar breed?
This is why I'm a Brexiteer, and this is why open borders are a bad idea.
Oh, tell me.
Right.
I didn't know any of this.
30-year-old Estonian electrical engineer with perfect English.
Yeah.
Welcome to the UK.
Yeah.
75-year-old Polish woman who doesn't speak a word of English and is in final stage kidney failure. Don't ring us, we'll ring you. 65-year-old obese Latvian woman who's been here for 10 years and kept on going out the department chain smoking and never done a job in 10 years and still needed a Latvian English interpreter 10 years after being in the country. No. Okay?
Yes.
These people are coming in the country. This is why we need to police our borders.
So these are the health tourists that one...
Yes,
except
they exist.
They're legal.
They exist. And the illegal Chinese guy we had once, he'd obviously come, I'm sorry to be crude, but he'd obviously come out the back of a lorry somewhere.
Yeah.
And he kept on coming into the local hospitals. And I think, but we could never really get to the bottom of it because he was very reticent on what he would say to the interpreter, and he spoke no English.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to this Cantonese interpreter, and I think he had a stomach ulcer.
Yeah.
Because we kept on giving him the medicine for, we kept giving him morphine, and he'd calm down, and then he'd discharge himself. And but we no one was interested. He was clearly of no fixed abode.
Yeah.
But like the police weren't interested. No one was interested. This guy was just left to roam around the place. And
yes, hoovering up medical care at the taxpayer's expense. Yes,
but I just thought there was like a telephone number you could ring, and say, well, we've got this guy here. We don't know where he's come from. He's clearly an illegal immigrant.
Yeah.
But, like, no one was interested. The police say, has he committed a crime? Well, possibly. Well, we got things to do.
Isn't it a form of theft? Because ultimately this money is coming out of the pockets of people who pay through their taxes, and it's fraud.
Yes, it is.
So
I can't disagree with that.
So tell me, because one hears different things about this, but how big a problem is health tourism in the NHS? How big a burden?
I don't think it's as bad as as a tabloid press would make it out, but it exists,
right?
And I've seen it.
Okay, like what sort of thing?
Just generally that kind of thing. EU citizens moving to the UK in old age, and then using the NHS. Often, but not always. Often they'll be following sons and daughters who've come. Okay, and then they'll move in with the son and daughter. But because they've had communist healthcare and dental care for 50 years, their 70-year-olds aren't as good nick as our 70-year-olds. Yeah.
So,
and that is the problem. That's why we need to police our borders better.
And you can't blame them for. I mean, if you were a kind of Estonian or whatever, and you came over here, and your dear old mum was sick back in Estonia. Well, maybe Estonian healthcare is really good, but if you were in a country which didn't have good healthcare, you can hardly blame them for coming over and taking the piss.
I had some Bulgarians once. Young girl, she had a urinary tract infection.
Yeah.
And she said to me at the end of it, she said, where do I pay? Who do I pay? Do I pay you? Yeah. And the notion of and I said, you don't pay in the NHS. And she looked at me as if I was mad.
Well, and in a way, the system is mad that allows such things. I mean, surely people should have to pay.
Well, yeah, but unfortunately, as you know, if you've got no money...
No, I'm not talking about people who've got no money. I'm talking about people who there's lots of people who could actually pay for medical care.
They would argue they do through their taxation anyway.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, they might argue that, but there's a significant chunk.
Well, you can't tax the poor because the poor have got no money.
No.
You can only hit the middle class.
I'm with you on the safety net principle, but and I can see I'm not going to get to the bottom of this with you because what I need is somebody from a think tank, an anti-NHS think tank, rather than.
Well, I'm sorry, but as I say, my experience is clinical, and not really managerial.
No. Absolutely,
I would have been crap at any sort of office job. As I say, I'm more of a frontline type of person.
Tell me before we go. You mentioned about how doctors are constantly nicking drugs and things.
Oh God, this is bad.
Yeah, bad but true.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's probably virtually every hospital I've worked in. There's been at least 2 or 3 doctors that have been. Nurses as well that have been nicking the diazepams, the morphines, the oxycontins.
To feed their habits or what, or to flog even.
I haven't heard of anyone flogging it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been rumours about people flogging prescription pads in Liverpool.
Oh yes. Yeah, you do surprise me.
Not my prescription pad. I don't have one. Not in A&E. But yeah, I mean, virtually in every hospital I've worked in, there has been a few suspicious characters that have disappeared very quickly. If they're lucky, they're quietly shown the door and nothing is said.
Right.
If they're unlucky, they'll send them to the GMC. And the GMC will then do all sorts of things like hair testing and all that kind of stuff that they do. Because the first thing that alcoholics and druggies do is deny it. So
that's true. They're very good liars. So before we go, are you going to give me one more horror story?
Well, I remember the guy who he was bleeding through his penis. He had a urological problem.
Whoa. Yes.
And his hemoglobin, his blood count was dropping and dropping and dropping, and we couldn't stop the bleeding. And normal human blood count is between about 115 to about 150. Okay? This guy's blood count had gone below 70, and he was starting to go pale. His blood pressure was starting to fall. He needed to go to urological theatre immediately. Okay? Yep. This is 3:00 in the morning.
Yep.
So obviously I'm a junior. I'm the dog's body. I can't do the surgery. we have to get the consultant.
Yeah.
Okay? Or his junior registrar.
Yeah.
The registrar's phone was turned off for 3 hours. The consultant kept on telling me to ring the registrar. Meanwhile, this guy's hemoglobin is dropping and dropping and dropping. About 8 o'clock, this guy's clinging to life while all this stuff's coming out of his John Thomas. And I finally get the registrar on the phone and say, look, this guy's going to die in an hour if you don't get him to theatre and we don't pump more blood into him. Because as fast as we were pumping blood into him, it was coming out of him. And he said, well, yes, but I promised to meet the consultant in the Costa Coffee. I said, please come. And anyway, about 10 o'clock, he came down in all his scrubs, rubbed his hands together and said, right, where's the patient? I'm sorry, mate, you died an hour ago.
We shouldn't laugh.
Got a cremation form out of it.
We shouldn't laugh. But he died that we might have a sick anecdote on this podcast, and we might
die in vain. Exactly.
And we might learn from it that the NHS is not in the most perfect of conditions, and something needs to be done. Heaven knows what. But Dr. Will,
yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
The pleasure is all mine. You've given me infinite pleasure with your podcasts over the last few months.
Oh, that's good.
So that's the least I can do.
Well, I hope that we've.
There's so much more we could have gone over, but maybe for another time.
Another time. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, on this 70th anniversary NHS edition with my special guest, Dr. Will. Thank you and goodbye.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
I think that it's the epitome of hypocrisy. Unless you fall in line with their liberal agenda, this uniparty, globalist, liberal agenda, they will never support you. They use the whole gender issue, of course, as some kind of tool to prop up their messaging, but it's the phoniest thing.
Sirius XM Patriot, Channel 125.